Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to pick up where we left off talking about physique development for personal trainers in terms of program design for their clients. And we're just going to start to move into the other variables that we didn't discuss in the previous video, talking about like volume, frequency, rest intervals, exercise selection, order, tempo, and how those things fall into the decision-making process, for making a program for a client. I'm just going to preface, if this is your first exposure to ourselves or the videos, what I would probably do is go back to at least part 1 of this particular series, just so you get a bit of an understanding of the other variables that we've spoken about in the previous videos in progressive overload, rep ranges, proximity to failure, just a couple of nuances there in the decision-making process before we start to dive into things like, training volume and frequency considerations. Now, going into discussing training volume and frequency, I think it's really important to understand that this is a really fluid thing. It does change a lot. Like, we can give you guys definitely, really good places to start and use some, research and data to give you guys a starting point, but it's going to change. Your volume's going to change based off your goals, based off your experience, based off your stress load, your recovery status, those kind of things. And then also, obviously, your frequency is going to change as well based off, your recovery status again, and obviously commitments, outside of life and, to your training. And that's the same, for your clients. But we can talk about, a good approach that we use when putting together, like a volume, a starting volume point for a client. Now, we like to break muscle groups up into, 2 subcategories. So we like to use, prime and secondary. Now, we've split these subcategories up. There's like 13 major muscle groups that we kind of target. And then the primary ones are chest, back, quads, hamstrings, biceps, triceps, lateral delts and calves. Now, the reason why we call these prime is because we believe that these movements, these muscle groups need direct stimulation in order for them to develop. The secondary muscle groups in the glutes, rear delts, front delts, traps, and abs, in a lot of circumstances, more circumstances than not, especially dealing with beginner trainees, beginner clients, they don't necessarily need a lot of primary activation, a lot of primary work. You can get a lot of development in a physique from doing, quad movements and hamstring movements. You can develop someone's glutes doing that. You can do a lot of front delt work from a lot of chest stuff, for example. So we believe that it's a really good starting point to use these, 8 primary muscle groups and these 5 secondary muscle groups to just understand, all right, we've got these muscle groups, where do we distribute the volume? Now, when it comes to allocating the volume, this is really rough at the moment, and there's some research that does support that about 10 sets per week is a minimum effective dose to hypertrophy a muscle group. Now, if you're a beginner, the dose might be a little less than that. You might actually be able to get away with about 8 to 10 sets, and we've seen that as well personally. So roughly about 8 to 10 sets per week of your prime muscle groups would be a really good place to start for a beginner. So if you're a beginner, that would be about 64 to 80 sets per week. So it could be, about 17 sets a workout. If we were training, let's say 5 days a week, if we're training 4 days a week, you probably could bring that down to maybe 15 sets a workout, something like that. Or if that person wanted to get it all in and they could take that amount of stress, you just need to get creative with your program design to fit those sets in over those 4 sessions. Now, I know what a lot of people are going to say. What if your client needs glute development? What if they have rear delts, underdeveloped rear delts? This is a context-specific situation, and this is why we can't tell you guys exactly what to do here. But what we know is that we need about 10 sets per muscle group to train a client, and we know that new clients' recovery status aren't great. So we would suggest that you don't go with more is better. You actually want to make sure that they can perform well, they can recover good, they've got good cognition and control, they're going into their workouts fresh, they're going to have things like, they're still going to be working on their nutrition, they're still going to be working on other things as well to make them perform better. So nailing them in the gym with 10 sets of, 15 muscle groups, which would be 13 muscle groups would be 130 sets a week, which is something that an advanced trainee would do, is not the best idea. Yes, there are extenuating circumstances where you guys can drive some volume to some things if you look at them physically and go, okay, this needs some work. 100% you can do that. Just use this as a little bit of a reference point to understand that, this is a good place to start. This person doesn't have a lot of skill, that the recovery is not that great. We can actually get a lot of stimulation just working on these particular exercises or these particular muscle groups because there's secondary stimulation in these other ones. And then we can kind of go from there. We've got a really good starting point, a really good framework to make sure that it's consistent across the board. And we're looking at things from client to client through the same lens and decision-making process, which is the most important thing. Now, when it comes to intermediates, things change a little bit. They need a little bit more volume because they're starting to find their feet in the gym. They're starting to, push the limits a little bit, but their skill's not quite there. So they can do a little bit more than a, trained athlete, but maybe not as much as an advanced trainee because they don't have the muscle mass or the commitment yet to warrant the extra stimulus. Now, what we suggest is just, increasing that 80% amount of sets, like the 64 to 80 amount of sets per week, which is about 10 sets per muscle group, to around 25% more total volume. So if we're going with, let's just say we're using the 80 sets a week mark, 25% on top of that would be 20, it would be 100. And then we also would factor in selection of exercises and training towards those secondary muscle groups in order to create an aesthetic physique. Now, what permits a beginner and an advanced trainee, in my opinion, is someone who's trained for 6 to 12 months consistently, taking care of all of the variables, programming, nutrition, those kind of things, getting everything in alignment. That's going to push them from a beginner to an intermediate. Now, again, it's only a rough starting point, but it's like these people can take more volume, their recovery status is higher, their commitment's higher. They're probably going to go 4 to 5 days a week. A beginner's probably going to do 3 to 4. It kind of warrants an increase in overall training load, but it doesn't necessarily always happen that way. Again, it's just a really good place to start, and it still adheres to roughly those 8 to 10 exposures as a minimum effective dose for growth for most muscle groups. So it falls in alignment here and it's consistent. Now, when we talk about training for an advanced trainee, this is where the variables start to skew quite a lot because the person can take a lot of volume and they could do 25% more than that. So they could do 120 to 130 sets per week. They've got they're dedicated to do 5 to 6 training sessions. They've got exceptional amounts of muscle mass. Their commitment to their diet is exceptional. They take no days off. Their recovery status is good. They got lots of sleep. They drink lots of water. They have a balanced diet, all of these kind of things. So they can definitely take more work, especially maybe in like a volume phase where they're trying to drive a lot of growth. And then they can also do a lot less work in some instances too. My experience in the past is, especially with people's, most dominant muscle groups, they can actually do the least amount of work on those because they can train them really hard and accrue the same stimulus that someone could, say, as an intermediate, because they have the skill and proficiency of the movement itself and their ability to push their physical limits and recover that is exceptional upon all other training groups. So just as a reminder, this is a really good framework to go off, but it isn't an absolute, and there's no absolute training system out there. We just want to have a really, really consistent framework to make decisions off so it's consistent across the board for all of your clients. Now, when it comes to training frequency, the research kind of supports that as long as we get the training volume in per muscle group, it doesn't really matter if we train 1 time a week, 2 times a week. It actually might even be detrimental to do any more than 2 times a week, just from like a recovery perspective. What we need to consider is the performance of those sets in a workout. So we like to use in most cases the 10 to 12 set rule, we'll call it, which is 10 to 12 exposures per muscle group per workout. As anything beyond that is probably starting to push the boundaries or like the acceptable standard for technique, execution, effort, those kind of things. Like I know if I've done 12 sets of a muscle group, if I do any more than that, it's not really performed to the maximum that I could. And, Could I have distributed that work somewhere else, that extra work somewhere else in the week, so I can have a couple of days to recover, get after it, accrue a greater stimulus, potentially get better gains. Now, I know that there's some people out there that like to still do like the muscle group blasting, do a specific muscle group, do a workout dedicated to that, move on to the other stuff and go from there. Now, this is where the personality of the client is really important. It's important to understand that if they prefer that, then probably lean towards that. If you're starting to do specialization phases where you're bringing up muscle groups, let's just say chest, for example, so you're going to have to increase the frequency because you're going to probably do more work. You might spend some days working on some skill stuff. You might spend some days kind of really getting after it with some heavy stuff. And then you're probably going to spend some days getting after it with some moderate to high rep range work too. For example, that you can't get that done in one session. You won't be able to get that person to perform safely, effectively, recover, those kind of things, all in one session. It's better off served across the week. Most of the time, if someone struggles with development in a muscle group, they either don't move well or they don't think about something in terms of cueing that could potentially, increase the effectiveness of the exercise. So they're going to need more exposures across the week just to give themselves the opportunity to learn than they are for other things that they're quite dominant in for whatever reasons that is. Okay, so now we're going to talk about rest intervals, which is, if you've kept up with the research and the data over the last couple of years, it's starting to change a little bit. It's actually starting to, really challenge and become the polar opposite of what we were kind of taught, a couple years ago, or maybe 5-10 years ago. It used to be told that we do this typical hypertrophy rep range of about 8 to 12 reps, and we would take about a minute's rest because that would be a sufficient amount of time to just get enough recovery to then go back into the session. We would still be able to get some recruitment. We would achieve failure. There'd be metabolites in the muscle that, potentially could drive adaptations for muscle growth, whatever pathways they were stimulating. And that's kind of what we got told. Now, what's eventuated, if we've kept up with the research, is things have actually moved the other way. If we actually rest sufficiently, maybe 2 to 3 minutes, for example, after a set, we actually are sufficiently recovered enough to lift more load, which exposes our muscles to more tension, which is going to be the greatest driver or the most significant driver of muscle growth over a longer period of time. So if we have the ability to rest longer when we're training and standardize that rest, we want to make sure that we're doing 2 to 3 reps, 2 to 3 minutes rest or something like that for our, heavy loads to moderate work. And then we might be able to, rest a little bit less for those lighter loads and, maybe do 1 to 2 minutes. But I'm always going to lean towards myself personally, encouraging people to rest longer if they've got the time to do so. If you don't have the time to do so, you can shorten your rest periods. You just have to standardize it because you're going to obviously want to standardize the training environment so you can still progress things like the load, which can obviously be influenced by how much we recover because fatigue is there and that's going to influence performance. But then you can also get really creative with your programming and start to maybe pair some exercise up. You might want to do some antagonistic supersets where, we're doing opposite movements. So things aren't really affected too much. There's a little bit of rest in between from a cardiovascular perspective. So perception of effort is lower, which is going to, make sure that we don't have a large amount of central nervous system fatigue about, which actually makes us perform less. So there's other options we have to still adhere to these principles where we can. Now, as a general gauge, if we're doing, movements, we've kind of split them up. So there's, we identify training movements as like compound movements, which is like multiple muscle groups don't really have much influence on, where the tension goes because it's a compound exercise that's multi-jointed and we just need to do the movement and perform the task like a deadlift or something. 1 to 5 reps, we would want to rest 3 to 5 minutes. 6 to 12 reps would be 2 to 3. Anything above 12 reps, if you're a psychopath, you would do 2 to 3 minutes as well because we want to make sure we're sufficiently recovered from a cognitive perspective as well as a muscle perspective and an aerobic perspective to perform the task at hand. Then we move on to large muscle groups, we call them. So this is movements where we're maybe in a machine, we're really trying to centralize the work, but there's probably, maybe a couple of more joints involved, but I wouldn't necessarily kind of talk about it as a really big free weighted compounded exercise. It might be something like, maybe an incline leg press, maybe a lat pull down or something like that, or maybe a pull up or something. Same kind of principles apply. 1 to 5 reps, 3 to 5 minutes rest, 6 to 12 reps, 2 to 3 minutes rest. Same with above 12 reps, we would want a 2 to 3 minute rest period where possible. Then we have our isolation exercises, which we don't really need to in my opinion, do 1 to 5 rep sets, unless you're doing some form of like tempo-based modifier, which we're going to talk about tempo shortly. So there's really no need to do low rep isolation exercises. Like it just increases the risk. There's too much shear force on the connective tissue and the tendons and the joints, just increasing the risk of getting hurt. 6 to 12 reps, 2 to 3 minutes again, making sure we're recovered, maximum amount of tension, to drive those adaptations. And then I guess after that, if we've got this 12 to 30 rep range that people work in typically to drive these adaptations that we want, we can do anywhere from 30 seconds up to 120 seconds. It just depends on the strategy that we're after, depends on the muscle group, it depends on the client, depends on their fitness, depends on their recovery status, all of those kind of things. But like I said before, make sure we can standardize it, and where possible, make sure that person can recover as much as possible to lift as much load as they can. That's generally what we're always going to advocate for. Now we're going to move on to exercise selection, talking about, how do we pick exercises to, drive these adaptations that we want, to get the most out of the client, to make sure that they can do things safely, make sure that it's repeatable and those kind of things. Now, there's a wide variety of exercise types. There's a wide variety of exercise variations in general. You can pick one exercise and have a magnitude of variations, and then obviously we can expose it to different types of tension as well. We've got free weighted, we've got machine, we've got cables, we've got bands. So there's many ways to, fully stimulate muscles. Now, when it comes to, maximal muscle development, physique development, it's like we really want to adopt a multi-planar, so multi-angled, multi-resistance profile, multi-exercise prescriptive approach to make sure that we can develop our body to the most symmetrical, outcome as possible. So this is where it's going to differ for a lot of people. Yes, we still want to have things in there like, maybe some compound exercises, and we still want to do maybe some strength work if that client's a, new to the gym, a beginner intermediate. But at some point we start to get really close to, or the precision really starts to get dialed in, and we start to pick really specific exercises to challenge specific portions of a muscle to regionally hypertrophy them as well, because we have the ability to dictate and influence where that tension goes. And we want to use that as a strategy to make sure that we're bringing up this body in a way that the client desires. Now, how we do that is we would just want to understand, what's involved in exercise selection for a muscle. We've got to think about the active joints involved. We've got to think about the muscle fiber orientation. We've got to think about how the force is influenced on the body, where the line of force is and what's being challenged and when. We've got to think about things like the resistance profile of a movement, where it's hard, where it's challenging. And then we also have to think about the skill of the client. So it's like if I've got a beginner client, I'm not going to be putting them in, a bar on their back, if they can't back squat, and they're trying to do that to drive, maybe hypertrophy of their quads. And all of a sudden they have really long femurs and a really big torso, and they kind of have to back squat with a really low bar position, and it's really hingy, and it's like there's not really much movement in the knee joint. So it's like we've got to consider all of these things. It's like, what's the best movement for the client? What's the best movement to stimulate the muscle tissue? Because the muscle tissue doesn't know the exercise. The muscle tissue only knows tension. It's just that we know the exercise, and we will always, as coaches, maybe gravitate to a certain amount of exercises. But the one thing that I would like you guys to be open-minded about is selecting exercises specific to the client. You don't want to be that coach that's, squat, bench, and deadlift heavy, and those clients can't squat and bench and deadlift proficiently, which is probably going to fuck them up, and they can't really kind of do the exercise or the rest of the workout to a standard that's going to get the results that they want, or they can't do the exercise to an acceptable standard to drive the hypertrophy adaptations. So it's like, why is it necessary? Like, could we not pick another exercise that gets more knee flexion, like a hack squat or a leg press or a single leg variation or something like that? If we've got clients with really long legs who can't back squat, like, we really can't be bound and biased to specific types of exercises when we talk about training for physique development, nor do we want to. We want the variety. These people are going to be in the gym often. Yes, you want constants in your program in terms of gauging progress, but you also want a bit of variability for it to be exciting, and obviously to develop on those muscles that are maybe lagging, that people kind of struggle with. So think about those considerations when we're talking about exercise selection. We've got articles and posts and stuff on Instagram and on our website that kind of unpack this stuff a little bit further. There's lots to it when we think about, it's not as simple as just going with a compound exercise and then making sure we just do a couple of things as well. It's like we can really influence and regionally hypertrophy a muscle, and we want to be able to do that to maximize the outcomes for our clients. Moving on from exercise selection, we're going to be talking about exercise order. Now, exercise order is going to differ based off the goals of the client and kind of where they're at in terms of their skill as well, or where they're at in terms of training age. So typically we have two methods that we would approach for a physique orientated client. The first one would be that we would really want to kind of stack the most complex, the highest amount of effort and skill-based movements at the start of the session. We've got to think about fatigue, and it's okay, well, when we walk into the gym, fatigue is at an all-time low. So if fatigue's at an all-time low, then performance is going to be at an all-time high. If we've got complex movements, barbell exercises using maybe a barbell RDL for an example, it's maybe we would want to put that exercise for this particular individual at the start, just so they're fresh, they have good cognition, control, and energy in the tank to perform that exercise efficiently and safely. So generally what we could do is stack those more complex movements at the start of the session and then move to, more fixed ranged, machine-based, isolated exercises as the session goes on, as well as fatigue surmounting, which is going to affect performance. So got to think about that as an approach, which is a really, really common approach. The one thing that we need to understand is as the session goes on, we're not going to be able to perform those exercises to the level that we could in an unfatigued environment. So if you've got a focus for the workout and you've got a focus for that particular client for a phase, for example, make sure you put the exercises, a consideration would be to put those exercises that you really want to work on at the start of the session so that person can really focus on those kind of things. And it's maybe the muscle groups where they're really strong with, and maybe they've got really developed quads, maybe they've got really developed delts. It's maybe put those at the end of the session because that person kind of feels those movements really well, has really good skill to do them. And it's they're really well developed as well. So it doesn't really matter if that person has fatigue affecting the performance of those exercises because it's not really the focus of the session and they're strong anyway. Now, the other approach is not necessarily looking at the complexity of the movement, but maybe the focus of the program and stuff like I just discussed. So what we might want to do is not only think about the complexity of the exercise, but you might want to put whatever the focus is for the workout at the start of the session, like calves at the start of a workout, not at the end. It's funny, people typically do the work that they need to do or want to do at the end of the session. It's I need to work on my calves, I'll do them at the end of the workout. When the end of the workout comes, they're that tired, they're that exhausted, they're I'll do them tomorrow, or they just do them in a half-assed fashion. And it's then it's no wonder why they don't have, big calves or big triceps or, a bigger chest or something like that. So it's we don't necessarily need to always look at the complexity of the exercise. You might need to do some cable flies to, get some effective stimulation of your chest at the start of the workout. Maybe, working with some specific angles and, that kind of thing, and making sure we've got the cognition because there's, no fatigue about to make decisions and control our body and put sufficient effort in, at the start of that session. So consider that as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be a complex exercise. It can also be, a movement that just needs to be the focus for the program or just for the workout, and you can do that, based off whatever the goals are for that particular program. And then you can also mix and match them as well. It's if you've got a chest specific mesocycle for those chest workouts, put those movements at the start, regardless of whether they're compound or not. And it's maybe for the other workouts that it's not specific to the chest, it's go with the more complex exercises, big bang for buck kind of movements at the start that gravitate more towards isolation at the end. So it's just having a little bit of a critical thinking process about how you put those exercises together, thinking about how one exercise affects the other, and just having a really good, asking yourself the questions of what would happen if I did this workout? What would happen if I performed this exercise and then this one next? What would it affect? Could I perform this next exercise sufficiently? Would it matter? Is it going to matter in the grand scheme of things? These are the things we need to ask ourselves when we create this exercise order of the program. And then we also need to understand if is it going to function in a gym? No one likes that coach that programs for, every single movement in the gym at 6 p.m. that's your client, performing that program, how it's written. So make sure that make sure that the program is realistic, as well as adhering to all of these other things that we're talking about when developing a physique for a client. Okay, so the last thing we're going to be talking about is tempo. So traditionally, tempo is broken up into 3 distinct phases of a rep. So we've got like the eccentric phase, which is like the lengthening of the muscle. Then we've got like the static lengthened phase, and then we've got the concentric phase. Now, what's happened over the last couple of decades is we've actually started to add in another phase to the exercise. So we've got like a static shortened phase as well. So what we would look at in terms of numbers is 4, which would be this lengthened position of the bicep, 1, which would be the static lengthened position, 1, which would be the concentric phase, and then 1, which would be the static shortened phase. So for example, it's like 4, 1, 1, 1, like this for argument's sake. So that would be each rep would take 7 seconds. Now, it's been widely preached in bodybuilding folklore that more time under tension equals more muscle growth, or more time equals more tension, which equals more muscle growth. So people have kind of always tried to look for a specific, an optimal time under tension that a muscle needs to be under. And somewhere, I remember reading or someone saying that it was about 40 to 60 seconds that a muscle needed to be under tension for. Now, things didn't really quite add up when you looked at other people's results and how they trained, and, just like, why is this person bigger when they, do like heavy rep sets that don't really last 60 seconds? Like, something doesn't really add up here. And I guess the beauty of time, like we've spoken about before, is that we have the ability to ask more questions, do some research, have data come out and come up with, maybe more logical conclusions at the moment on what could be driving those adaptations. Now, when we look at time under tension relative to load and effort, so I'm talking about how much weight someone can lift to the rep and reserve that they need to elicit the stimulus for muscle growth, it doesn't really matter if you take a dynamic rep range or if you use a tempo to get to the same rep and reserve. So let's say I'm trying to get to a 2 rep and reserve. I do 10 straight reps with a load. I get to 10 reps. I could have done 12. I've selected this load. It's 50 kilos for shoulder press or whatever. And it's like, okay, I've got stimulation there. If I took another loading, maybe 35 kilos, and I did maybe 15 reps, I did, a 7-second rep for each one. I got within 2 reps in reserve. The stimulus is exactly the same and the adaptations are going to be quite similar. So it's quantified with data and research at the moment that providing we work to the same rep and reserve, that tempo doesn't really matter if someone wants to do some form of dynamic rep range. Now, where does tempo sit in terms of tools for a client? Well, it's a really, really good way of learning and being conscious of movement and what things feel like and where to put our body and how to contract and how to lengthen muscles. So we can use it as a strategy to move slow, to learn fast. That's the concept that we like. And we like to use it with really beginner clients. It's really valuable in a strength setting to acquire skill of a movement. If you've got a client, even from a bodybuilding or physique development perspective, that just can't get the exercise, it's like, slow it down. Add a few pauses in the squeeze position, add a few pauses in the lengthened position, get them to feel what that muscle feels like and the feedback that's going back to their brain so they get a better understanding of what's trying to be achieved here. And it's like at some point they'll probably gravitate away from those tempo-based reps, probably more towards a dynamic setting where you're going to start chasing load on the bar. Now, the thing with chasing load on the bar is tempo is going to change relevant to your proximity of failure, because you're going to start to get slower muscle fiber shortening and lengthening speeds, or more shortening speeds as you get closer to fatigue. So that's going to alter the tempo too. So it's just some considerations to think about. Now, what we can also do with tempo is we can manipulate where the stress is going and maybe manipulate certain environments or focus on certain areas of the muscle. So using something like eccentrics, really driving like the eccentric phase, spending some really like more time there. Even the static lengthened position, which, static lengthened tension has been noted now as a really significant driver of hypertrophy. So we could potentially adopt, some more time under tension principles based around those areas of the muscle, that phase of the movement, to just drive some more growth for a client. So we've just got to know what's the tool used for, and how do I use it in the box of tools that I've got for a client. I think it's important to understand that we still need to adhere to like the force velocity relationship and understand that, fast twitch muscle fibers will only start to, be stimulated through motor unit stimulation when the speed of the rep is at a certain amount. Because if the movement's too slow, let's say we're going really excessive here, beyond 10 seconds, it's like the weight is that light and the movement is that slow that the threshold isn't being hit to recruit those fast twitch motor units, which aren't going to recruit those fast twitch fibers. So we also have to take that into consideration when we look at the timing of those rep cadences for a client for a specific, goal, and to understand this time under tension kind of principle and how to use it. Okay, so we've unpacked a lot of things here. We've talked about, in the first episode, progressive overload. We've talked about reps. We've talked about proximity to failure. We've talked about rep ranges, exercise selection. We've talked about it all. Hopefully by now you guys have got a really good understanding of all the pieces involved in putting a program together for a client who's totally dedicated to physique development. Even if they've got a little bit of a strength goal as well, you can still put these pieces together around that focal point of strength to make sure that that client is strong and is developing the physique they want. Would really like to hear your feedback on this one, guys. Don't forget to kind of hit the link in bio, go down to the website, make your way through all the resources, give yourself a scorecard check, see where your business is doing really well, see where you need some work. We'll see you in the next video. Hope you guys enjoyed this one.